The Ambassador Bridge, one of the most critical trade arteries between Canada and the United States, has always been more than just a stretch of steel and concrete. It's a symbol of economic interdependence, a daily conduit for billions of dollars in goods, and for decades, it has quietly handled the pulse of North American commerce. But imagine a scenario where that lifeline falters, where control over its operations, access, or stability is suddenly compromised. Not a distant hypothetical, but a shock that ripples instantly across industries, governments, and everyday lives. At first, the disruption seems manageable. Traffic slows, inspections tighten, and logistics companies begin issuing cautious advisories. But within hours, the reality becomes harder to ignore. Thousands of trucks that typically cross the bridge each day begin to stack up. Supply chains, already finely tuned and often operating on just-in-time delivery systems, start to wobble. Automotive plants in Ontario and Michigan feel the strain first. Assembly lines that depend on synchronized deliveries from both sides of the border begin to idle. Workers are sent home early, not because of a lack of demand, but because a single choke point has thrown off the rhythm of production. Canadian officials quickly realize that this isn't just a transportation issue, it's a strategic vulnerability. For decades, reliance on a handful of major crossings, especially the Ambassador Bridge, has made trade efficient but also fragile. When control is disrupted, whether due to political conflict, infrastructure failure, cyber interference, or security threats, it exposes how concentrated and delicate the system truly is. Emergency meetings are called in Ottawa. Trade ministers, transportation authorities, and national security advisors gather to assess the situation. The question isn't just how to fix the immediate problem, but how to prevent such dependency from crippling the economy again. Within hours, contingency plans that had long been sitting in policy binders are dusted off and activated. Alternative crossings become the immediate focus. The Detroit-Windsor Tunnel, typically reserved for passenger vehicles, sees discussions about temporary commercial use expansion. The Blue Water Bridge in Sarnia begins to absorb redirected truck traffic, but it's already operating near capacity. Delays stretch from hours into days. Rail networks are pushed to take on additional freight, but shifting cargo from trucks to trains isn't seamless. It requires coordination, equipment, and time that businesses don't always have. Meanwhile, the economic consequences begin to snowball. Grocery stores in parts of Ontario start noticing delays in shipments of fresh produce. Manufacturing sectors beyond automotive, like pharmaceuticals and electronics, begin reporting shortages of critical components. Small businesses feel it too. A bakery waiting on specialty flour from the US, a construction company missing key materials, a tech firm delayed by a single missing part, all are suddenly connected by a disruption hundreds of kilometers away. Public reaction grows as news spreads. Social media fills with images of backed-up highways and idle trucks. Analysts on television debate whether this is a temporary crisis or a wake-up call. Some point to years of warnings about infrastructure bottlenecks and underinvestment. Others highlight geopolitical tensions and evolving threats that make such disruptions more likely in the future. Canada's response begins to shift from reactive to strategic. Officials accelerate plans that were once considered long-term ambitions. Ports on the East Coast, such as those in Halifax and St. John, receive increased attention as alternative entry points for goods. Western routes through British Columbia also come into play, despite being geographically less direct for central Canada. The idea is no longer just efficiency, it's resilience. Trade agreements and partnerships are also reevaluated. Canada begins exploring ways to diversify not just routes, but trading partners. While the United States remains its largest and most important ally, the crisis highlights the risks of over-reliance. Conversations about expanding trade with Europe and Asia gain urgency. Investments in domestic manufacturing are revisited, with policymakers asking whether certain critical goods should be produced closer to home. Back on the ground, logistics companies adapt in real time. Some reroute shipments through multiple smaller crossings, even if it means longer travel times. Others experiment with intermodal solutions, combining trucking, rail, and shipping to bypass congested points. Technology plays a role too, with companies using real-time data to optimize routes and minimize delays. But even the most advanced systems can't fully compensate for a major artery being compromised. As days pass, the pressure mounts. The Ambassador Bridge isn't just a crossing, it's a cornerstone. Its disruption forces both Canada and the US to confront a shared reality. Their economies are deeply intertwined, and vulnerabilities on one side quickly become problems on the other. American industries feel the impact just as strongly. Factories in Detroit and beyond face the same shortages, the same delays, the same uncertainty. Diplomatic channels intensify. Both governments work closely to restore stability, but they also begin discussing broader reforms. Infrastructure investments become a priority, not just in repairing or securing the bridge, but in building redundancy into the system. New crossings, expanded rail capacity, and upgraded ports are no longer optional, they're essential. At the same time, questions about control and ownership come into sharper focus. Who ultimately governs critical infrastructure like the Ambassador Bridge? What safeguards are in place to ensure it remains secure and operational under all circumstances? These aren't just technical questions, they're political, economic, and strategic. For ordinary citizens, the crisis brings a new awareness of how interconnected daily life is with global trade. The price of goods fluctuates, availability becomes unpredictable, and the invisible systems that usually operate smoothly are suddenly front and center. It's a reminder that behind every product on a shelf is a complex network of routes, agreements, and infrastructure. Weeks later, as the situation gradually stabilizes, the immediate crisis may fade, but its lessons remain. Canada emerges with a renewed focus on resilience. Investments in infrastructure begin to take shape. Policies aimed at diversifying trade routes and partners gain momentum. Businesses rethink their supply chains, building in more flexibility and redundancy. The Ambassador Bridge itself may return to normal operations, but it no longer represents just efficiency. It symbolizes a turning point. A moment when a single disruption forced a nation to rethink how it moves goods, how it manages risk, and how it prepares for an uncertain future. And perhaps the most lasting impact isn't the delays or the economic losses, but the shift in mindset. A recognition that in a world of increasing complexity, control over critical systems isn't just about ownership. It's about adaptability, foresight, and the ability to respond when the unexpected happens. As the immediate shock gives way to a more controlled recovery, something deeper begins to unfold beneath the surface, an institutional shift in how Canada approaches national logistics and economic security. What started as an emergency response begins evolving into a long-term transformation. Government agencies that once operated in silos, transport, trade, infrastructure, and even defense, start coordinating in ways they hadn't before. The disruption has made it clear that supply chains are no longer just an economic concern, they are a matter of national resilience. New task forces emerge, bringing together public and private sectors. Major logistics firms, rail operators, port authorities, and technology companies are invited into strategic discussions. Their insights from the front lines, what failed, what adapted, what nearly collapsed, become critical data points. This collaboration leads to a fundamental redesign of contingency planning. Instead of assuming stability with occasional disruption, planners begin assuming disruption as a constant possibility. Insurance markets react as well. The cost of insuring cross-border shipments begins to fluctuate, especially for goods routed through high-risk choke points. Companies that once prioritized the cheapest route now weigh reliability just as heavily. This shift trickles down to consumers in subtle ways: slightly higher prices, longer delivery windows, and a growing emphasis on transparency. Businesses begin communicating more openly about where products come from and how they move, knowing that customers are paying closer attention than ever before. Technology accelerates its role in trade infrastructure. Artificial intelligence systems are deployed to predict bottlenecks before they happen, analyzing weather patterns, traffic data, geopolitical signals, and even labor conditions. Blockchain-based tracking systems gain traction, offering secure and transparent records of goods as they move across borders. These tools don't eliminate risk, but they make the system more responsive, capable of adjusting in real time rather than reacting after the fact. Meanwhile, regional economies within Canada begin to rebalance. Areas that were once peripheral to major trade routes start gaining importance. Smaller border crossings receive upgrades, local infrastructure is expanded, and communities that had little involvement in international trade suddenly find themselves playing a more central role. This redistribution of economic activity brings opportunities, but also challenges. Local governments must scale services, manage increased traffic, and address environmental concerns. Environmental considerations, in fact, become impossible to ignore. The rerouting of trucks over longer distances leads to increased fuel consumption and emissions. This unintended consequence sparks renewed urgency around sustainable transportation. Investments in electric freight vehicles, expanded rail electrification, and greener port operations begin to accelerate. What started as a logistical crisis begins influencing climate policy, tying together two issues that were often treated separately. On the geopolitical stage, the event subtly reshapes Canada's position. Allies and trading partners take note of how quickly a single disruption impacted North American trade. Some see it as a vulnerability, others see an opportunity for deeper collaboration. Canada begins participating more actively in international discussions about supply chain security, advocating for shared standards and cooperative frameworks that reduce the risk of similar disruptions elsewhere. Education and workforce development also feel the ripple effects. Universities and technical institutes begin expanding programs focused on supply chain management, logistics engineering, and infrastructure security. A new generation of professionals is trained not just to optimize systems, but to stress test them, to anticipate failure points and design around them. The crisis, in a way, reshapes career paths, drawing talent into fields that were once considered niche. For businesses, the concept of just-in-time inventory undergoes a reevaluation. While it remains efficient, it is no longer seen as sufficient on its own. Companies start building strategic reserves of critical components, even if it means higher storage costs. Warehousing experiences a resurgence, not as a relic of the past, but as a buffer against uncertainty. This shift changes the physical landscape as well, with new distribution centers appearing in regions that offer strategic advantages. Financial markets reflect these changes. Investors begin favoring companies that demonstrate supply chain resilience, not just profitability. Metrics evolve to include risk exposure and adaptability. Firms that quickly adapted during the disruption are rewarded, while those that struggled face increased scrutiny. Over time, resilience becomes a competitive advantage, shaping how businesses operate and how they are valued. Culturally, there's a subtle but important shift in public awareness. People begin to understand that the flow of goods isn't guaranteed. It's maintained through complex systems that require constant attention and investment. Media coverage, documentaries, and even classroom discussions start exploring these themes, turning what was once an invisible network into a topic of national conversation. As months turn into years, the legacy of the disruption continues to influence decisions. Infrastructure projects that might have taken decades to approve are fast-tracked. Redundant systems, once seen as inefficient, are now recognized as essential safeguards. The idea of a single point of failure becomes unacceptable in critical networks, whether in transportation, energy, or digital systems. And perhaps most importantly, there's a change in mindset at every level, from policymakers to business leaders to everyday citizens. Stability is no longer taken for granted. Instead, there is a growing recognition that resilience must be built deliberately, maintained continuously, and tested regularly. The experience becomes a reference point, a case study that shapes how future challenges are approached. In the end, the story doesn't conclude with the restoration of a bridge or the normalization of traffic. It continues in the systems that were redesigned, the policies that were rewritten, and the awareness that was raised. What began as a moment of lost control becomes, over time, a catalyst for a more adaptable and forward-thinking approach to trade, one that acknowledges uncertainty not as a threat to be feared, but as a reality to be prepared for.